A soldier can fight through an entire battle and never know what the battle was. He was there, he heard the guns, obeyed the orders, watched men fall on either side of him. His experience of that day is real, vivid, and his own, and still the battle itself escapes him. Because the battle is not any one man's experience of it. The battle is the actual course of events, the resultant of conflicting plans now successfully and now unsuccessfully executed. Even the commanding general does not know it, because his plan was only one plan among others, and the outcome obeyed none of them completely. Now widen the point. What is true of the soldier in the battle is true of you in your own time. Something is actually happening in your community, your culture, your church, and you are living through it without knowing what it is. This is the paradox Bernard Lonergan takes up in chapter 8 of Method and Theology. His phrase here is memorable. History is concerned to determine what, in most cases, contemporaries do not know. The last episode ended with a question. Once interpretation has told you what one author meant, what was going forward, not in one writer's mind, but in the whole community he belonged to, what is that? This chapter is Lonergan's answer. History is the third functional specialty. Research gathers the data, interpretation determines what the data meant, history determines what the meanings, the actions, and the failures added up to. And it opens with a distinction that's easy to miss. There is the history that is written about, persons and groups acting in time. And there is the history that is written, the account that expresses knowledge of it. How the second ever reaches the first, he says, is a matter of no little obscurity. But why? Well, not because there are no good historians, but because historical knowledge is an instance of knowledge, and few people possess a satisfactory theory of knowing. So Lonergan applies his own account of knowing to the special case of knowing the past. The chapter moves in 3 steps: nature and history, historical experience and historical knowledge, and third, critical history. The first step begins in an unexpected place: time. Ask what time it is, and you treat time as a number or a measure. That is the Aristotelian definition. Time is the number or measure determined by the successive equal stages of a local movement. Refined from Ptolemy through Newton to Einstein, that clock time matters for dating events, but it is not an adequate account of what time is, because it suggests a false image. Time as a raceway of indivisible instants. And Aristotle himself pointed past it. Just as time is the measure of the movement, so the now corresponds to the body that is moving. Each successive movement is different, but within the difference there is an identity. Apply that to consciousness. There is succession in the flow of conscious acts. Identify an identity in the subject of those acts, and synthesis in the objects. Analysis may reveal a succession of notes or chords. Experience hears a melody. What results is what Lonergan calls the psychological present. That is, not an instant, not a mathematical point, a time span. Now add the group. Besides each individual's memories, there are the pooled memories of the group, their celebration in song and story, their preservation in written narratives, in coins and monuments, and every other trace of the group's words and deeds left to posterity. Such, Lonergan says, is the field of historical investigation. Now, what makes this field peculiar? Human action has a conscious side and an unconscious side. And apart from pathology, the conscious side is in control. And that conscious side is a flow of intentional acts differentiated by meaning. In episode 3, we saw that human beings live in a world mediated by meaning. So the historian's field is meaningful speech and action, not physical motion. And now comes the chapter's central term. What was going forward? Lonergan's sentence here is precise. He is not content to understand what people meant. He wants to grasp what was going forward in particular groups at particular places and times. Determining what was meant is the exegete's task. The historian envisages a different object. By going forward, Lonergan means to exclude the mere repetition of routine. He means the change that originated the routine and its dissemination. He means process and development, but no less decline and collapse. So what was going forward is not a timeline and not the sum of what the leaders decided. It is a concrete process, origination, dissemination, development, deterioration, breakdown. That is one of the most important definitions in the entire book, because it makes failure as much history's business as achievement. Pious people say that man proposes, but God disposes. The historian is current to see how God disposed the matter, not by theological speculation, not by some world historical dialectic, but through particular human agents. The claim is about knowledge, not about concealed forces. And he gives 4 reasons for it. Because experience is individual, while the data lie in the experiences of many. Because events result not only from intentions, but also from oversights and mistakes and failures to act. Because history concludes from what has happened, and no one in the middle of things has that vantage point yet, right? Because it requires interlocking and intermeshed discoveries that bring the significant factors to light. The same definition separates history from natural science, whose objects are not constituted by acts of meaning. Where science expresses its discoveries in universal systems, the historian writes narratives about particulars. So in history, verification is parallel to how an interpretation is judged as correct. Now, the second step turns from the field to the knower. Human knowing, Lonergan says, is not just experiencing. It is a compound of experiencing, understanding, and judging. So if there is historical knowledge, there must be historical experience, historical understanding, historical judgment. To show what historical experience is, he runs a thought experiment. Suppose a man suffers total amnesia. He no longer knows who he is, cannot recognize relatives and friends, and has lost even the skills for his customary tasks. Either the amnesia is cured, or he must start life over from the beginning. Because our pasts have made us whatever we are, and on that capital we have to live. Now suppose every member of a group suffers the same loss, and group functioning collapses as totally as the man did. Here I think Lonergan's line is unforgettable. Groups too live on their past, and their past, so to speak, live on in them. He is not offering a medical account of amnesia, but portraying the significance of the past in the present. Considered interiorly, this being historical has a name, that is existential history. It is the living tradition which formed us and thereby brought us to the point where we begin forming ourselves. But that tradition is only rudimentary. It's only rudimentary enough for the group to have an identity. How does one move from living off the past to knowing it methodically? Lonergan builds a ladder. It begins with a diary, a record of what seems important, significant, new. As retrospect lengthens, The judgments are corrected and the sources enlarged, and the diary becomes memoirs. One ransacks memory and reconstructs each former sitz im Leben, each concrete setting of one's past life, and as an interpretation, there builds up context, nests of questions and answers on determinate topics. Organize those into periods, and the memoirs become an autobiography. Shift to research and evidence in the third person, and autobiography becomes biography, which to reach a later generation must be a life and times. A biography, the times clarify the life. In history, the times becomes central because there is social and cultural process, not just a sum of individual words and deeds. It is a developing and deteriorating unity constituted by cooperations, by institutions, by personal relations, by a functioning and malfunctioning good of order. The historian's task, Lonergan says, is a view of the actual functioning of the whole or of a notable part over a significant period of time. That brings us to the third and longest step, critical history. And Lonergan approaches it through its ancestor, precritical history. For precritical history, the community is the conspicuous community, one's own. It is narrative, recounting who did what, when, where, under what circumstances, from what motives, with what results. And its function is practical. A group functions only by possessing an identity, knowing itself and devoting itself to its survival and betterment. So precritical history is never just a narrative of bald facts. It's artistic in that it selects orders and persuades. It's ethical in that it apportions praise and blame. It's explanatory in that it accounts for institutions by their origins. It is apologetic in that it corrects tendentious accounts of the people's past. And, of course, it's prophetic. It joins foresight to hindsight. Lonergan does not sneer at any of this. Handing on a heritage is a real task, and precritical history, purged of its defects, might serve communications very well. But it is not the functional specialty history. The specialty has a principal concern for judging, for settling matters of fact, for setting forth what really happened. In Ranke's perpetually quoted phrase from the German, how it actually was. And unless the work is done in detachment, apart from apologetic aims, it serves two masters. And it usually suffers the evangelical consequences. And critical history is not a matter of finding testimonies, checking them for credibility, and stringing together what is credible. Lonergan's verdict here is blunt. The string of credible testimonies merely re-edits historical experience. It does not advance to knowledge of what was going forward. Rudolf Bultmann set out to grasp the whole formation of the Synoptic Gospels from evidence that did not presuppose belief in the truth of the evangelist statements. Because a process as a whole is not something any single witness ever testified to. It has to be discovered. So, how is such knowledge reached? By a series of discoveries. Because evidence has to be discovered. Lonergan draws one of the chapter's most useful distinctions here. Potential, formal, and actual evidence. Potential evidence is any datum, here and now, that is perceptible. Formal evidence is that datum understood, used in asking and answering a question for historical intelligence. Actual evidence is the datum grounding a reasonable historical judgment. Evidence is not lying around waiting to be collected, and what starts its discovery is the question for historical intelligence, asked about some defined situation in the past. And any such question presupposes historical knowledge already possessed. He says history then grows out of history. Critical history was a leap forward from pre-critical history. Pre-critical history was a leap forward from stories and legends. A question is put to some datum. And if insight comes, it becomes a surmise, then an image, then a further question. When the surmises coincide with further data, potential evidence is becoming formal. Stay on the right track long enough, and the question begins to come from the data itself, drawing one out of one's own assumptions and into the perspectives proper to the object. Lonergan gives this a striking name. The process, he says, is ecstatic. Not enthusiasm, not rapture, not a lapse into subjectivity. His words here are exact. It is not the hot ecstasy of the devotee, but the cool one of growing insight. It takes one out of oneself. The same process here is critical too. And the word critical here has teeth, because insights are not only direct, but also inverse. By direct insight, one grasps how things fit together, and one murmurs, Eureka. By inverse insight, one exclaims, how could I have been so stupid as to take that for granted? Eventually, a direct insight grasps that item belongs in some other context. In pre-critical history, critical meant testing your authorities' credibility before believing them. In critical history, it means shifting data from one field of relevance to another. Criticism is not disbelief. Criticism is relocation. Here, the distinguishing mark of critical history. The whole process occurs twice. In the first instance, one comes to understand one's sources. In interpretation, the aim was to understand what an author meant. Here, it is what the authors were up to and how they did it. In the second instance, one uses the understood sources to understand what was going forward in the community. And the two developments are interdependent. Understanding the events revises the authors, and the revised authors revise the events. That double movement is how data become facts. When may then the historian finally judge? As understanding accumulates, insights organize into dominant and subordinate themes and topics. Part by part, investigations come to a term. They do so when the historian has reached the set of insights that hit all nails squarely on the head, and the stream of further questions on a topic finally dries up. If there are no further relevant questions, then he can say that, as far as he knows, the question is closed. That is the criterion for historical judgment. Yet the positive content of judgment aspires to be more than the best available opinion. Not certainty, not a verdict beyond appeal, the best available option. Revision can come from two directions. New sources emerge. Archaeology reshapes the ancient Near East, and the Qumran yields documents bearing on the New Testament, and later events keep enlarging the context, the way the outcome of a battle fixes the perspective on its stages, and victory in the war reveals the significance of the battles fought. Yet neither source of revision simply invalidates earlier work competently done. New documents fill out the picture and refute what was speculative, but they do not dissolve the network of questions and answers that made the original data massive evidence for the earlier account. Some contexts are closed, others are still open. As Carl Huesi put it, while Nero will always be Nero, we cannot as yet say the same for Luther. Everything stays open to revision. Competent work still stands. Fallibilism without corrosion. Besides the judgments a historian reaches his peers and successors pass judgment on his work. Lonergan calls this critical history at the second degree, based not on belief or disbelief, but on understanding how the work was done. And with that, the circle closes benignly. The historical knowledge every new question presupposes is exactly this critically appreciated cumulative body of the profession's work, not a vicious circle. What we have is a spiral of growing knowledge. 2 boundary lines finish the chapter. Communications is excluded. Historical knowledge must be communicated, but history and communications name different tasks. And unless their distinction is maintained, there is no exact understanding of either. And relativism is deferred. The historian's views on possibility, his judgments of value, his whole world view do influence his writing, and critical history cannot eliminate that relativism entirely. But it can and does affect a partial elimination. Partial, not total. What remains is handed to the 4th specialty, dialectic, 2 episodes from now. So the chapter ends modestly and firmly. Lonergan's closing formula is quietly confident. There exist procedures that, ceteris paribus, lead to historical knowledge. Other things being equal, the procedures work. So let me draw this entire chapter together. History seeks what was going forward. Origination, dissemination, development, and no less decline and collapse. It seeks what contemporaries, for the most part, did not and could not know. It cannot be reached by stringing credible testimonies together because testimony only re-edits experience and knowledge has to be discovered. It is won by a cumulative process of discovery that is heuristic, ecstatic, selective, critical, constructive, and, in that limit, judicial. It runs twice, once through the sources and once through the community the sources reveal. And it issues in the best available opinion, open to revision, yet solid enough to build on. In the next episode, we move to the historians themselves, because once Lonergan has stated his own account of historical knowledge, an account built from his theory of knowing, the next question becomes unavoidable. When historians describe what they actually do, does their testimony confirm this account? And how can a history be objective when no historian ever escapes his own standpoint?